welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this deep dive session as part of the Social Outcomes Conference. This deep dive will focus on the shifting narratives and logics for the use of social impact bonds. And the session will feature some academic presentations and also some practitioner perspectives on the use of social impact bonds. We'll be thinking particularly about the different justifications and merits of social impact bonds. We'll probably start using the term SIBs. The justifications are multiple and sometimes uncertain. Are these tools for driving efficiency, effectiveness? Some might suggest they're extracting social value. Others might suggest they're enabling government to enact more different, more collaborative forms of services. So we have some great presentations lined up. But the theme that we think connects them is this focus on the narrative or the stories that we tell ourselves about the impact bond model. Some of the presentations will focus on particular case sites. So we'll hear practitioner experiences and reflections from very specific impact bond projects. But we also have some interesting and quite cutting edge research that starts to look across the different narratives, comparing different projects in different communities, and also looking at the ecosystem as a whole. So I'm thrilled to welcome our panelists to this session. First of all, we have Mathilde Pellizzari. Mathilde joined II Lab in 2018, and excitingly, her PhD research is based in this organisation, and her PhD focuses on social impact bonds and is in collaboration with the Centre for the Sociology of Innovation at Paris Tech. Welcome, Mathilde. Vincenzo Buffa, we have presented together before. Welcome, Vincenzo. Vincenzo is a PhD candidate at Audencia Business School and the University of Angers. Welcome, Vincenzo. Celeste Brubacher, it's lovely to have you, Celeste. Celeste is the Vice President of Impact at Village Enterprise, where she focuses on developing systems and processes to really drive the best possible pathways for increasing impact, and uses human-centered design and data-driven decisions in her work there. And then we're joined by Vanessa. Vanessa Picker is a DPhil candidate in the Department for Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. Vanessa's a fabulous scholar. She's a Clarendon scholar, and it's really exciting to hear from some of the cutting edge research that is happening from PhD scholars. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I also wanted to introduce Richard. Richard Johnson will act as a discussant across the session. Richard's senior advisor at the Global Fund and also a senior consultant with the World Bank. He's also a GoLab Fellow of Practice and will be helping us think through the practical implications coming through some of these studies and findings. Before we kick off with the presentations, I just wanted to remind everyone that this is our first hybrid conference. So there are some people in the room with us in Oxford. Welcome, thanks for joining us. And there are also plentiful participants joining online. So hello everyone, thank you for joining us. We're really keen to get into a discussion in the second part of the session. So please do use the chat function within Zoom to log any comments or questions for our speakers and panelists. And we look forward to picking those up as we move through the session. We've kept panelists to just 10 minutes for their presentations. So what we'll do is we'll move through these presentations in order, 10 minutes each. We'll take maybe one or two quick questions after each presentation, and then we'll move into more of a discussion where we can pick up other comments and reflections from the audience. So thanks for joining us, everyone. If you'd like to introduce yourselves in the Zoom chat, that would also be lovely to have a sense of who is on the line. But welcome. And let's kick off with our first presentation. And our first presentation is going to come from Mathilde. So it's over to you, Mathilde.
Thank you very much, Elle. So I'll be talking about trials of implementation in social impact bonds, contrasting orientations in the formation of SIB policies in France, Colombia, and Chile. And this research is part of my PhD, actually. And it tackles, well, it talks about the phenomenon of circulation of social impact bonds worldwide, which could be viewed as the mere replication or transfer of the same model to different countries and its integration in different policy traditions. However, I think that this is more complex than that. What happens is more likely a transposition or even a reinvention of the model over time and space. So to start with, I identified three branches in the literature that cover the promises and threats of SIBs. The first group focuses on the practical merits and limitations of SIBs. It questions their efficiency and the kind of policy objectives they can address. This group of literature likely gives practical recommendations for a better use of this mechanism. The second category considers that SIBs are a symptom of wider transformations in political economy, driven by a neoliberal rationale, bringing depoliticized metrics, market-based logics, which could undermine the capacity of the state to elaborate adequate welfare policy. The third group challenges the financial rationale brought about by SIBs, the valuation operations that require the agency of investors, agency in the sense of their power. Then I ask, what about the diversity of SIB arrangements and the situated political implications? Indeed, the literature does not consider the actual diversity of SIB material arrangements, and I argue that we should look at the situated political implications to complement analysis relying on general and rather blurry notions like neoliberalism and financialization. So how does what I have termed transposition happen? In which specific trajectories do SIBs develop in different contexts? To answer to these questions, I use the notion of trials. So within the tradition of pragmatist sociology, the idea of trials refers to the practical tests that actors face in the mundane exercise of justification and critique when they need to reach common agreements. Boltanski and Thévenot developed that. Latour had previously offered a more radical treatment of the notion, considering that reality itself is the outcome of some kinds of trials. So the paper points out the diverse problems SIB implementation carries and how, in the process of becoming explicit and resilient, it takes different institutional arrangements and political meanings. Put differently, the very nature of SIBs is made explicit in multiple and contested forms as it faces practical trials of implementation. And this approach has been developed by Muniesa and Linhart. So the study builds on qualitative research conducted from 2018 to 2020. I think it's the previous slide, please. Thank you. In Chile, Colombia, and France. The cases differ in terms of SIB development stages, interaction between development and national policy, political traditions, and SIB material arrangements. I conducted 51 semi-structured interviews with public and private stakeholders involved in SIB development, and I was engaged in participant observations of different kinds. And I also collected about 100 documents related to SIBs. I argue that SIBs take different shapes depending on the different trials that SIB practitioners had to face. This included in particular different forms of alignment between various actors and different emphasis on what SIBs are meant to be or not in each case. The case of Chile is marked by governmental drive in the implementation of SIBs. What triggered the dynamics on SIBs was that Sebastián Piñera, elected president in 2018, had promised to commit $50 million for payment by result. This amount was really too high to be realistic. But a significant point of discussion, a trial of implementation, arose in 2019 about the role that the state should play. According to the actors, the state should be more engaged in SIB policymaking than in other countries. Both the Ministry of Social Development and the Ministry of Economy took a leading role. To government officials, SIBs made sense in regards to a specific imperative, the one of public accountability, which led to close state supervision. I will read a quote from an official which reflects the specific role that the state should play. the state has to take an active role, not so much to define the implementation and how this is going to happen, but rather to guarantee that there aren't bad practices. Our role is to define a methodology that would be as robust as possible so the state doesn't forget, but at the same time doesn't influence the results, because this depends on the performance of implementers. And accountability became an even more prominent narrative during the violent social movements that rose up in the country at the end of 2019. So overall, SIP development was framed as a technocratic procedure consisting of rigorous and transparent methodologies. While trying to implement SIPs in the country, the actors went through questionings about, on one side, the technical specifications of SIP, the legal frameworks, the data available, etc. But all this reflection also opened boxes on very political questions, like the supervising role of the state and the imperative of accountability in extremely tense political moments. In Colombia, the SIP program was embedded in efforts to develop evidence-based approaches to policymaking. There, the SIP initiative came from private actors, like the international consulting firm Instiglio, three major Colombian foundations, of which Fundación Corona, and from the international donors, IDB Lab and SECO, the Swiss Secretariat for Economic Affairs. And the partners shared the goal of implementing an innovative outcome-based financing scheme for the first time in Colombia, targeting the field of inclusive employment for vulnerable people. The ambition of the partners materialized in 2017 in a project called SIPSCO, co-funded by IDB Lab and SICO, and involving funding from the government, for the Colombian government. So within SIPSCO, two SIPs were implemented, one at the central level and one at the local level in Cali. And then the project managed to scale up the scheme by supporting the creation of an outcome fund, now managed by the government. And one particular trial that SIP practitioners faced there was around the question of scale. SIPs were actually part of a narrative on public innovation, implying that state policy would gain in sophistication through the production of evidence and accountability. This kind of production, that what you see on the screen, started to create figures on social policy making. Here, it's about public investment in different programs, including SIPs. And whereas in Chile, the accountability principle justified a technocratic approach, in Colombia, it's legitimized capacity building for the government in support of data and also of the creation of an impact investment market. So public innovation took the shape of a collective undertaking driven by evidence and market ideals, which took the government with it. And to finish with, in France, from 2014, French actors, mostly from the government and from the nascent impact investment field, started to examine this highly criticized Anglo-Saxon tool and ways to adapt it to the French context. The trials faced in the definition of the desirable nature of SIPs crystallized around a series of threats that SIPs would carry, such as high return on investment for investors or competition between social organizations. In 2016, the Department for the Social and Solidarity Economy launched a call for SIP proposals focused on the general area of social innovation and open to organization from the social economy. Calls for proposals are meant to be uncompetitive and to elicit proposals from the fields to be really bottom up. SIP financing was thus framed as a complementary funding only for innovative programs, aside traditional grant funding from the so-called welfare states, which had to be preserved according to the actors. So in the end, 10 SIPs were set up as a result of the 2016 call, and they adopted a partnership approach which puts the social providers at the center. And interestingly, an informal consensus led to cap the return on investment at a reasonable level. It's what's mentioned here in ILAB code of ethics. So very quickly in conclusion, I wanted to highlight 2 points. First, SIBs have only a few standardized features. This is why the models vary over time and space. Can we go to the next slide, please? And the second point is that SIBs are really politicized mechanisms, and trials of implementation reveal the situated political implications of their development. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mathilde. Really enjoyed that, and really nice to see the comparative case study work. And does anyone have a question that they would like to pick up with Mathilde, either in the room, or you could raise your hand if you are online using the hand raising function on Zoom? Okay, well, I have a quick question before we move on to the next presentation from Mathilde. I'm curious, you conducted qualitative research in these very different contexts. How was it to spend different time, and how quickly did you feel able to immerse yourselves in these different environments?
Yeah, actually, after a while, only after a while, I realized that I really went to Colombia and Chile with my very French position of, yeah, the welfare state should be preserved, and the way SIBs were implemented in France, or maybe the most ethical way to do. And then I realized that it was really dependent on the local political context, and that I didn't really have my word in that. It took me, really some time to realize the different problems that the actors were facing, and to realize that they were really context dependent. It was also a learning for me along the research.
Thanks for sharing that.
I have a quick question for Mathilde. You focused a lot on the diversity across these different SIBs that you've looked at, but you note here there are only a few, you say, but a few standardized features. Can you tell us briefly what you think are the common features across all of the SIBs?
Yes, well, first is the fact that governments have to pay for outcomes. So in all the contracts have a really strong focus on outcome measurement and outcome definition. And another feature is that there is an involvement from investors. So there is private financing involved, and financing vehicles. But I think those are the only standardized features that we can see in SIBs: payment for results on one side and investment on the other side.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
James.
Sorry, James, I missed you.
Just a very quick question. Picking up on the last session, Mathilde, from your field work, were there any examples where evidence or claims of evidence of outcome influenced the public debate?
You mean after SIBs were implementing, once the results were measured?
Of your field work in relation to implementation? Or was
Sorry?
I'm not quite sure what the timing of your own field work was in relation to the to particular cases of the...
Yeah, well, I'm still involved in all the French social impact bonds, and there are very diverse implications on the way policy is made, I think, in France. I haven't seen really wide implications. Then we can have like information systems that have changed thanks to social impact bonds, and these are the kind of consequences that will last beyond the time of the project. I think in Colombia, the focus was really to be able to change the way policy was think about and was designed. And with the launch of the Outcome Fund within the government, I think they have managed to create really lasting consequences of those social impact bonds. I don't know if this answers to your question.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd like to pass over to Vincenzo now. And Vincenzo is asking, is there a life after impact bonds?
Oh, great. Hello, I'm Vincenzo Buffa. Really happy to have the possibility to present you this research. This is a part also of my PhD, but this research is also made in collaboration with other 3 colleagues from France. So Benjamin Lependevin from Audencia Business School, Mathias Guérino from University of Nantes, and Julian Kleshowski from ESG Business School based in Paris. So this research is based on the scaling process of social impact bond. But first of all, some context of the research. So we can first highlight how a growing number of scholars have shed light on the potential of public innovation to better respond to wicked social problems and great challenges. Really quickly, this literature, mainly based on public management, identified 2 types of public sector innovation. Firstly, from one side, we have some process-centered innovation, in which innovation shape the functioning of public activities with new technologies, new practices management, or new governance innovation. On the other side, secondly, we have the policy-centered innovation, which are centered in the evolution of the core activities of public organizations, such new services or new policies. Next slide, please. So the second one, please. So this research are mainly based on the Rogers framework that are so mainly based on the adoption phases of innovation. But we need to highlight how in order to achieve the full potential of a public innovation, this innovation need to be sustained over time and scale up on a big level. This is why our research is based on the scaling process of public innovation after the phases of adoption. In order to do that, we use the theoretical framework of innovation barriers. It firstly appears in the more general innovation studies, and we try to apply that on the scaling phases of public sector innovation. Really briefly, we from DEST identify 4 main categories that we will try to apply to our cases. So some contextual barriers based on organizational, political, or legal level. More internal barriers, so linked to the efficiency and adaptability of the innovation that we need to scale up. Capability barriers linked to resources, financial, organizational resources, and also process and interaction factors barriers, so linked to the relationship between the stakeholder engaged in the scaling process and then the influence that can have this relationship. In order to study this process, we have the case of the social impact bond scaling process. These are really interesting cases for in order to study this process. Why? Because the SIB, one of the SIB promise or justification are that the rationale for setting up such contract is that if successful, the experimentation financed by a SIB had to be scaled up and massively deployed. So we had one tool that had this scaling promise inside of one of their rationale or justification. Next slide, please. So our study includes the first SIB programs in the world which have been achieved for at least 2 years from the beginning of our studies in March 2020. We conducted a field study mainly based on a qualitative methodological approach. So we collected and analyzed 24 grey literature documents, and also we conducted and analyzed 32 semi-structured interviews with the various stakeholders, all of these 17 SIBs that then we grouped in 8 SIB projects. I will show you in the table, the next slide. This is our sample. As you can imagine, a huge part of our sample is populated by UK SIBs, between them, so the first worldwide Peterborough SIB, the 10 DWP Innovation Fund SIBs, the 2 London Homelessness SIB, and then also the first 4 continental Europe SIBs, one in one each in the Netherlands, in Germany, Belgium, and Portugal. So first, before to go to our result showing the impact of these different barriers, we need also to highlight how something that we call the scaling trajectory observed by after the end of SABs. Are quite different trajectories, but more, if you want to synthesize, we highlight a really more present development of process innovation, so payment by result, evaluation tools, and SABs more generally, and a really less presence of a scaling of policy innovation. So for us, the policy innovation is really the program financed by SAB. So after the end of SABs, we show how we have, for example, for the DWP Innovation Fund, a really limited policy innovation deployment that are financed by new SABs. Or in other cases, so a regional deployment of the policies, for example, in Belgium, that are also accompanied by development of SIBs. We have also cases like in Germany with a quite total absence of scaling for both policy and process innovation. Then pass to the next slide. Thank you very much. So really briefly for some insight for our results. So concerning the 4 categories that we analyze, so contextual factors, so linked to political and cultural factors. One of the most impactful that we identified is the impact of the general political agenda, or what we can call also the SAB momentum. Something that we can see for the UK case, like in this quotation from one of our interviews. So the shift between the David Cameron Big Society program, where social impact board were at the core of this political manifesto, and the government next, so with Theresa May, that we saw a shift to more Brexit centered policy or interest. So we saw how this SAB momentum can change, and also linked to that, also the willingness of political actors to scale up SABs and policy financed by SABs. Next slide, please. So concerning some internal factors, so the adaptability and efficiency of policy and process innovation, we can very briefly, yes, next. For the Netherlands, for example, we can, not the previous, please. How, for example, someone of our interview said how there is not many SAB funds in Holland left after the first experimentation of SIBs in this country. Why? Because mostly in municipalities, because the Netherlands are really local-based procurement. People working in municipality really think that SABs are not adaptable and not efficient enough in order to justify all the effort that they need. So how also this internal factor can hinder the scaling process of innovations. Next one, please. Also concerning these capability factors linked to financial resources availability, we can highlight one case from the UK, in which one of the, even if the policy innovation, so the social program financed by a first CB was totally a success. So then the social provider had encountered the same difficulties that they had before the SAB, and they needed to stop the program, even if it was, yes, a success, and is of course is more linked to lack of financial resources that can be more impactful than the measurement and evaluation that was made before the end of the SABs. Next, please. So the last factor, so the impact of the coordination is also the engagement between different actors. So in this case, it's more different administrative level between central government and local government. Another time, from the UK example, in this quotation, we can also go directly to yes, the feeling that had these actors to this failure of the part of central government in order to really support the concept of payment by result in local authorities that don't have the organizational financial resources in order to really scale up this tool. In order really to handle really quickly with 3 points of discussion, so we try to contribute on the public sector innovation barrier at the scaling and diffusion phases. So we try to specify the nature, the importance, and the effect of these barriers, but also the interviewing and relationship with process and policy public sector innovation in these diffusion phases. And more generally, we show how the better understanding of the scaling innovation barriers is important in order to understand the diffusion of innovation in the public sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincenzo. Thank you very much. There's an interesting question from Louise Savelle in the chat. Are you able to read that and respond, Vincenzo? Louise is asking about the difference between process and policy innovation and the distinction between what we might mean by policy innovation in your case.
Great, thank you. Good question. Because yes, for us, so the process innovation are the new tools, new practices in order to better perform a public action. So for us, SIBs is a process innovation that try to bring more measurement. So also new practices linked to the relationship with investors. So yeah, for us, for example, the SIBs are the process innovation. They are more scaled up in our cases than the policy innovation. That for us are new ways to try to solve social problems. So for us are the program financed by the SIBs. So really what the social provider put in place in order to, for example, reduce some of the social issues that they try to, yes.
Great. Thank you for picking that up. Thank you very much. I don't see any other questions at this point, but please do feel able to keep contributing in the chat with your questions and comments for our panel. But now I'd like to hand over to Celeste. Over to you.
Great, thank you. Could you just go to the, thank you. So at Village Enterprise, our mission is to end extreme poverty through entrepreneurship and innovation. We do this by equipping first-time entrepreneurs with the skills and assets needed to start small businesses. To shed more light on the work that we do, I'd like to read a small excerpt from a testimony of one of our Kenyan-based entrepreneurs. Her name is Gladys. VE helped me form a business group with my friends Everlyn and Eunice. We named it Yutana, which means help each other. Yutana's business includes a small retail and cereals shop. My life transformed. My children went back to school. We got shoes. We could finally afford to buy meat. Sickness is my biggest fear for my children and myself. But now I can afford transport to the hospital. These types of changes and more are what we hope to provide for all of the entrepreneurs that we support. And we believe that outcomes-based funding can provide the incentives and the flexibility to innovate, to be able to consistently provide those types of results. And so that is why we were excited to co-design and implement the first Development Impact Fund for poverty alleviation in Sub-Saharan Africa. Next slide, please. This project was a $5.23 million project, of which $4.28 million was earmarked for outcomes funding. Village Enterprise was responsible for raising the working capital for the project. And so the amount of investment that we needed was $2.325 million, which we successfully raised. Through the project, we trained over 14,000 new entrepreneurs who in small groups launched nearly 5,000 businesses. Next slide, please. We implemented the project over 7 program cycles, with the first program cycle starting at the end of 2017 and the last program cycle ending at the end of 2020. The primary outcome of interest for the project was the project's impact on household income. And so this was evaluated with an external RCT conducted by a third-party evaluator. The project had been designed to have 2 rounds of evaluation, with the first 4 cohorts scheduled to be evaluated in March and April of 2020, and then the last 3 cohorts scheduled to be evaluated 1 year after that. March and April of 2020 were just when the world was closing down as a result of the first global wave of the coronavirus pandemic. And so that first wave of data collection had to be postponed, and we ended up doing 1 joint wave of data collection for the entire project this summer. We just completed the data, or the third-party evaluator just completed the data collection about 2 weeks ago, and so we are looking forward to receiving the final RCT results for the project in about 2 months. Is part of the RCT, we did integrate an experiment into the study where approximately 1/3 of the business groups were provided triple the grant size. And so in the slide, that little table where you see the counting of the number of businesses with the low versus high transfer, that relates to the experiment that we integrated into the study. Next slide, please. So now that we've reached the end of the implementation of the DIB, we have some reflections on the value of the DIB for ourselves. So first, and probably most importantly, is that we firmly believe that our initial thoughts that there would be, that the outcomes-based nature of the contract would help us to that the accountability and the flexibility for innovation within the outcomes-based nature of the contract would help us to achieve results we firmly believe was true. In the course of the impact bond, we made a number of improvements to our program and our operations. A couple of examples of improvements that we made were updates to our training curriculum, updates to our safeguarding policies, and design and launch of a new adaptive management system complete with customized dashboards for multiple levels of the organization and tablets for our front-facing staff so that they could access their customized dashboards and also have paperless access to the updated training and training manual and support materials. Next, yeah. And so the entire organization actually ended up benefiting from the impact bond, because after we designed and rolled out our improvements within the DIB project, we then rolled out those improvements to the rest of the organization. However, we believe that in the context of implementation, the environment is constantly changing, and that trying to scale a program brings new context. So we believe that there's constantly room for innovation to achieve impact. And so we believe that there is a role for ongoing use of outcomes contracts. The third reflection on the value of the DIB for us was that we found that across the stakeholders that we partnered with on the DIB, and also amongst Village Enterprise staff, that focus on the outcomes for the project really actually helped align our thinking and our conversation around how to drive those outcomes, and so around the welfare of the beneficiary. Next. And then finally is an added bonus for Village Enterprise, with this being the first impact bond for poverty alleviation in Africa. It did help increase our visibility in the RBF and poverty alleviation spaces, which is always good for a nonprofit organization.
Thanks very much, Celeste. Really interesting to have this project experience that's clearly had to change considerably during live running. It's great to get those reflections. I'd like to invite any questions for Celeste. Please do type them into the chat or feel able to raise your hand.
A performance question, Celeste. Can you comment on the sustainability of the businesses that were started? Do you have that data?
So we right now the data that we have internally is data that that we collected through our internal monitoring and evaluation systems on the health of the businesses during our year of implementation. The randomized control trial that was conducted, it explicitly collected information on consumption, assets, and savings at the time of data collection. And so the project is meant to pay based on increases in lifetime income attributable to the project. And so we have so essentially what we're doing is we're looking at the change in consumption over that's seen at the time of observation and extrapolating backwards for what that means for the observation period, and then to predict the sustainability of that impact over time, we're looking at the change in assets and savings that was observed over that period.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I see James, your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's fascinating. It follows on slightly from the same previous question. This issue of timing, given the well-known churning effects that we see in small enterprise and informal economy in the region, and I'm thinking particularly of the Chris Blackman study in northern Uganda, which is now a celebrated study based on an RCT over, I think, 10 years. They've now got up to in terms of evaluating youth enterprises over time. So how much voice did you have, and how was the process of deciding when the end line would be conducted, on the basis of which the payment indicators would be judged? Because obviously, it's kind of, do you want to be sooner? Do you want to be later? I'm just interested in the process by which that bit of the contract was agreed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that what you're mentioning, you're sort of pointing a little bit to the budding that we see in these types of contracts between the learning agenda and the practicality of needing to access results, both to integrate learning into the project and also to be able to pay back the investors. And so the timing for our evaluations, it prioritized getting what we placed as a priority was getting learning as soon as possible within the project in a time that would be reasonable to let the implementation finish and to see some results. And so we actually early on wanted to evaluate 7 times after every single cohort. But of course, from a budget perspective, that was inaccessible. And so the compromise ended up being that we would have 2 rounds of evaluation, 1 after the first 4 cohorts and 1 after the last 3. One of the things that we've discussed and we're open to, and that we think would be important for the learning agenda, is maintaining our control groups, control groups, so that we can follow up in a couple of years with a longitudinal assessment.
Thank you. There's a question at the back, and there's also a question online. So I'll come to the back of the room in a moment. I just wondered if I could ask Tim Biddy, would you like you've posted a question in the chat, and I wondered whether you'd like to come off mic and ask your question for Celeste direct.
Yes, thank you. It was just related to the experiment that you mentioned in terms of within your evaluation, and I was curious how you determined which groups received triple the grant size compared to other groups, and whether that was representative of all groups that received funding, or if you focused in on a specific set of groups.
Sure, yes. So that was an exploratory experimental arm. And so when we were designing the project, we were a little bit concerned about providing increased grant size within villages, because we felt like it could be demotivating to business groups that received the regular grant size. So we ended up actually identifying a single geography where those businesses that would receive the triple grant size were located. So all of the businesses that we worked with in that geography received the increased grant size.
Thank you. Could I bring you in to ask your question? And please do introduce yourself so that our online audience are aware.
I'm Julio from Southeastern Asset Management. And my question was in regards to, I'm not sure if you're familiar with ASI, so ASI International, UK listed microfinance business. And I'm aware that they operate in Kenya as well, and they do a somewhat similar, hence the question, activities that you are describing with your NGO. I was just curious if you could compare, if not ASI specifically, just private sector, essentially trying to develop these activities, and just opposing that to what your experience has been from an NGO perspective, and see if there were any learnings there, very different approaches to it.
I'm not familiar with the organization that you're speaking about, but I think I can speak maybe to our experience compared to like the microfinance sector. So for our program, we target the ultra poor. And so this is a population that, even though the microfinance sector has done an excellent job of reaching the poor, the ultra poor are often still left out from that sector, or if they do access microfinance, don't necessarily, capital is not their only constraint to elevating themselves out of poverty. And so our program is a multifaceted program that provides training, mentoring, seed capital in the form of small grants that do not have to be paid back, and ongoing mentoring, and then support for formation of savings groups, so that this population who often doesn't have access to financial services at all has groups to save and lend with, and a source of social support. So our program, compared to what we've seen offered by like microfinance players, for example, it just I think the difference is that we are offering solutions for additional dimensions that we believe are holding people in poverty.
Thank you very much, Celeste. Thank you for all of your questions. And just to let you know, you can keep contributing in the chat, and we will have a bit more time for discussion shortly. But now I'd like to pass over to Vanessa. So Vanessa will be talking about mapping and understanding the global diffusion of social impact bonds over time, with some pretty cool analysis. So over to you, Vanessa.
Thanks, Zoe. Well, it's great to be here today. And as was mentioned earlier, I'm a PhD student here at Oxford. And I'm going to be talking about the research that I've been doing recently using social media data, specifically Twitter data. With over 500 million tweets posted per day, I think it's safe to say that the majority of us in this room probably interact with Twitter in our everyday lives, whether that is through tweeting, retweeting, or simply scrolling through to find interesting content. When it comes to academic research, though, it's a little less utilized, especially in this field. And I think, you know, it's safe to say it can be easy to dismiss. We might think of tweets as only being a maximum of 280 characters long. Often they're much shorter. And what about those Twitter bots? You know, we might think there's not much that this can actually tell us about social impact bonds. But over the next 10 minutes, I'm going to try and convince you that this is actually really crucial data to look at, especially when we're thinking about how narratives have changed over time. So if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that the objective of this study is to quantitatively and qualitatively analyze the available Twitter data to understand how the idea of a social impact bond has been socially constructed to be a legitimate reform to pursue over time. So what I mean by that is that this idea has essentially been framed over time by different people. We've had different interactions. It's been put forward as a valid reform to pursue. And a lot of that has played out in these online forums. So I think so far this has sort of been overlooked, this source of data, and I'm here to hopefully tell us something interesting about what that says. So the next slide talks about the methods. So basically, to obtain this data, I built a data set using Twitter's full archive search API. And some of you in the room and even online might be a little bit worried about whether you're featured in my data set. But don't worry, I'll just be presenting some aggregate findings here today. So basically the data set consists of all the tweets that have been posted between 2010 to 2020 that have used the relevant SIB hashtag. So the great thing about Twitter data and what makes it really good to build data sets with is that, you know, often these sentiments are captured with a hashtag that can then be pulled into the data set. So this consists of about 14,000 roughly tweets in total. So I was able to conduct some statistical analysis of the entire data set. I then conducted some more in-depth qualitative analysis of the data of a random sample. And that was quite important because although tweets are short, they often include different documents and things that you can click through to. So when I used a smaller sample, I was able to sort of trace the tweet all the way through. And then I also conducted a discourse analysis of the most highly retweeted tweets because we can assume that they're being retweeted because, you know, people think that they are worthy, they have something interesting in there, or out of an attempt to persuade us, again, that this is a good idea to pursue. So moving on to the next slide, I think before we sort of dive into the Twitter data, it's really important to think about what existing sort of ways of measuring interest in a topic might tell us about interest in SIBs. And one way of doing that is obviously to look at the annual citations with the assumption that, you know, citations are a relatively objective indicator of interest over time. And if we look at that, I mean, it paints quite a good picture of SIBs, doesn't it? It shows this gradual increase, which is still increasing. You could assume from this that we haven't yet reached the peak of the momentum. And you probably look at this and think, well, no, it's not a passing fad or a fashion. It's here to stay, and the interest is still increasing. But if we move on to the next slide, the other sources of data paint quite a different picture, and I'm here to say that they shouldn't be overlooked. So as a few quick examples, we've got Wikipedia page views, we can see Google Trends data, and we can also see the Twitter data, and they're slightly different with the curves, but they show quite a similar picture, which is that there was, you know, there's been this initial interest, which probably maps onto all the enthusiasm around Peterborough, and then with most of them, that's been sustained for a little bit, and more recently, there's been a dip probably since around 2016. So if we move on to the next slide, we can zoom in on the Twitter data, which is what I'm mainly going to focus on here today. And as I mentioned, in terms of volume, we can see that initial interest, the sustainment, and then the dip with it went back up again actually in 2017, and then it dipped again. But it shows quite a stark example of this online interest continuing to decline. So if we move on to the next slide, I think this sort of probes some interesting questions, doesn't it? If we're just looking at volume, you know, has that decreased over time because the idea has become so accepted, for example, that we no longer need to talk about it as much? Could it be that it is a passing fad or fashion? Is it just a change in terminology? Maybe it's that we're using different hashtags, or could it even be that the comms teams have changed and, you know, we have less resources put towards publicizing the idea? So moving on to the next slide, this could be a controversial view, but I think, you know, if we map this on as well to the data about SIBs usage, thanks to the Indigo dataset, which I'll give a bit of a plug to, it also seems that SIBs usage has been declining over time. So that doesn't really support the viewpoint that maybe we're just not tweeting about it because it's not new anymore. And it prompts what might be a controversial question in this forum, but I think it's worth asking. Has this been a passing fad or fashion, and have we already moved on to the next thing? So if we move on to the next slide, I think, you know, more so than just looking at the volume, we can also look at the sentiments and the discourses and things that are being discussed. And I think that's when the Twitter data gets quite interesting. So sentiment analysis, just for a quick intro, which is what I started with, is where we can use predefined libraries to basically quantify sentiments in data sources. I don't know about anyone else in the room, but the thought of assigning a sentiment to over 13,000 tweets was quite daunting. So I turned my attention to the pre-existing libraries and sentiment dictionaries that are already out there. And the graphs that I'm about to show, they include several different, the application of several different sentiment libraries, because obviously it's quite a nuanced and complex field. So I wanted to test out some different models. So if we move on to the next slide, what we'll see here is that it seems as though, on the whole, negative tweets have largely been drowned out across the 10-year period. So it doesn't really matter which of these 5 different models, which are regularly referred to in the literature, it doesn't matter which one we use, you can quite quickly see that there are not that many negative tweets emerging, especially compared to the neutrals and the positives, and then it hasn't really varied over time. It's just sort of been over time, not as many, and that sort of creates this perception of maybe an echo chamber for the positives, that that's what's getting shared, and that we're dampening out the negatives. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that there's some higher variation between the different libraries and models that have been applied, but there are some general trends here, which is that sort of initial spike in enthusiasm with the positives that seems to have dipped, and then interestingly, there's been this resurgence. Even though the volume is going down, the positives are picking back up, and I have a hunch that maybe that is because of sentiments around what role can SIBS play in the COVID recovery, or the sort of enthusiasm when SIBS turned into development impact bonds and thinking about applying that to the SDGs. Moving on to the next slide, we've seen different trends observed in the academic literature. So my first question after seeing those trends was, I wanted to see how that compared to the sentiments that have been expressed in the academic studies. So what I did for this was I looked at all the journal articles that have been published over the same time period. I looked, especially when assigning sentiments, at the findings and conclusions, and then coded them manually myself. And you see here that it's sort of the opposite thing that's happening. There's been negative sentiments are increasing pretty steadily in the academic literature, and the positives are decreasing. So on to the next slide, what that's sort of saying is that as the negative findings have accumulated over time, there hasn't been a similar growth in the tweeting of this doesn't actually work. And in recent times, there's actually been a growth in the positive sentiments. So there are a number of reasons why this could be the case. And I'll put forward one, again, maybe controversial viewpoint. If we move on to the next slide, I'm sitting here wondering, could that be because of our sort of fascination with change? We're always looking for the new style, the new fashion, the new fad. And have we already moved on without really tweeting about the negatives or what we're being cautious about? So moving on to the next slide, I think that it's also interesting to look at what's been shared in the most retweeted tweets, because obviously, as I said, these are being shared for a reason. So I limited the data set. I looked at the tweets that have been shared at least 5 times, which doesn't sound a lot, but that accounts for more than 2,000 tweets in the data set. So moving on to the next slide, what you can see here, I don't know if that's loaded, is that the discourse categories, which are sort of we're all familiar with from previous studies, they feature very heavily, not surprisingly, in the top retweets, especially the social finance discourse and also the impact discourse. So it seems quite trendy, obviously, to talk about how innovative this new funding model is, to talk about all the private capital coming in, and obviously to talk about the impacts and the data and the measurement. If we move on to the next slide, that's even more evident when we look at the subcategories. So again, lots of talk, especially about better outcomes, about measuring benefits, about shifting to prevention, all those things that we're quite familiar with in the academic literature. If we move on to the next slide, I think actually, one more thing is that cautionary themes have also emerged, and you'll see that these don't feature as much. If you look at, how many retweets do they feature in and how much does that get amplified? It's obviously a smaller number, but I think these ones, we need to listen to them because, are these just not getting shared more because of what I mentioned, that echo chamber of positives? And also, some of these are quite concerning, I would suggest to look at. And they sort of point to the possibility that there might be that excessive hype and maybe the innovation is continuing to spread off the back of that. So moving on to the next slide, this is quite interesting. Despite outcomes and measurement featuring heavily in the discourse, as you can see here, academic studies and impact evaluations are rarely mentioned in the top retweets. So it seems that we're much more sort of immersed in talking about the launch of SIBS than paying attention to the impact evaluations and the, whether it's the quarterly statistical release of data. So you can see here that journal articles featured only in around 3% of the top retweets, evaluation reports only in about 5%. If we move on to the next slide, also when I coded the top retweets and looked at what events were mentioned, it again suggests that we set these things up with great enthusiasm and perhaps we don't look at the results. So you have to scroll down quite far to see, tweets that are mentioning, for example, the announcement of results coming from impact evaluations. That's in 0.71% of the top retweets, or academic research being released is only around 2% of them, which probably makes some of us sad, I think. But moving on to the next slide, we can see that, not surprisingly, as I tracked this over time by looking at the random sample, and this sort of spoke to what I mentioned before, that it seems to be more sort of trendy and attractive, I guess, in the retweets and the tweets to talk more about the social finance discourse, the impact discourse. I suspect they're going up and down largely in tandem because a lot of the tweets will talk about the way that this mechanism blends social and financial good and that it goes hand in hand. And I was quite surprised actually that, collaboration features in a lot less of them, and that the interest in sharing content around that seems to have dipped as well. But my final graph that I'll share in my time limit, if we move on to the next slide, I think it's quite interesting, to think that it's not just the narratives and the logics that have shifted over time. I think that we should also pay attention to the fact that it's also the use of the persuasion techniques that has changed over time. The techniques that are used to sort of convince us of a particular discourse or narrative. And, when we think about Twitter, there are some Twitter-specific techniques that can be used, whether that is including particular emojis or humor or imagery or things like that. But in the public administration literature, there are also things like, for example, talking symmetry, which means talking about a specific problem, such as a lack of intervention funding, and then also talking about the solution. So in this graph, you can see how many tweets in that sample specifically mentioned a problem and then put SIBS forward as a solution. You can see the percentage that are potentially deliberately focusing on the public good, because that creates quite a compelling story. And then also suspension of disbelief is interesting. That's around sort of getting rid of any doubts about this model and the fact that it might not have worked before by painting it as a new innovation that we haven't heard of before. So my point here is that I think that this is a very social rhetorical process that's been played out. And when we think about the shifting narratives, we should also think about these techniques that have been used to help one of these narratives win out over the others. If we move on to the next slide, I think I need to wrap up here, but there are a number of strengths, limitations, and opportunities. So on the next slide, in summary, this is the first study, to my knowledge, which has used this largely untouched data, which comes from all of the social media data. And 10, 11 years on, there's quite a bit there now, which I think that we should be drawing on in these discussions. It's a large data set. It can be combined with other data. So I'm sort of, maybe a bit biased, but I'm sort of excited by what we can achieve with this. There are some natural limitations. For example, some tweets might have been relevant, but might not have used the relevant hashtag, wouldn't have been picked up. The 2021 data hasn't been included yet. The impact of COVID-19 hasn't been accounted for. And obviously there are well-documented biases to do with Twitter data and selection bias, and obviously circling back to the Twitter bots. But yeah, I think that, this is just an initial sort of step forward into the possibilities of using this data. If we move on to the next slide, there's some quick sort of ideas about what we could do next. And if anyone is interested in collaborating on this kind of stuff, then feel free to reach out. I think there's a lot of work to be done, exciting work in terms of sort of refining these classification models that classify things like sentiments in this very complex field that we operate in. I think we could compare this Twitter to the Twitter that's generated in other online forums, with Reddit being just one example. I think there's a lot of scope for network analysis, and also things like regression models where we combine the Indigo data, giving another plug to that, with Twitter to see, for example, how much the Twitter noise is contributing to SIBS uptake or otherwise. So I'll leave on the next slide just with a passing quote here and a passing sort of thought. Hopefully I've done a few things here. Hopefully I've sort of convinced you of the worthiness of at least looking at this data. I hope I haven't scared people off tweeting about it. You might view my data set, but it's valuable insights that are coming from that. And hopefully, if nothing else, I hope that I've sort of prompted policymakers and SIBS stakeholders to think about the fact that this is a social rhetorical process that's playing out. And, there are some ideas, SIBS possibly, that are winning, that are being framed as something worthy to pursue. And in the process, there might be a lot of other ideas that are being cast aside, that are being drowned out and dismissed. And so I'd encourage us to sort of hopefully broaden the debate and think about if there's been an opportunity cost, if maybe we haven't considered other models and how we can consider them moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much for a very energising presentation, Vanessa. And I'd love to take any questions. So please do, if you're in the room, put your hand up or pop your questions for Vanessa in the chat. But while people are typing in, I had one question. I was very interested in the different thematic analysis, and you talked about the social finance, the collaboration, and the impact. Could you talk about how you selected and refined why those three, and how did you navigate any overlap between those?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's obviously, I would say that there's more room for refinement in that. I think, it was quite an inductive process with this sample of going through and assigning different codes to those. And with those sorts of methods, it's an iterative process of going back and forth. But I think in this sort of area, when we're talking about discourse analysis, maybe not for social media data, but other sources of data, there have been some great studies that have already been done that have produced some sort of frameworks that we can look to. And the one that I looked to, which I thought seemed to be quite evident in the Twitter data set and a good starting point, was the Ormiston study, Jared Ormiston, in 2020, where they used press releases so I didn't sort of start with that necessarily in mind. I'd done the inductive coding, but when I looked back over it, I quickly saw that a lot of those the categories that had emerged from their study were evident in this. I mean, I also sort of cross-checked. I've conducted previous systematic reviews, and obviously there's a systematic review that we spoke about earlier today. I think there are some pretty well-known categories that have emerged from all of the wealth of qualitative studies that have been done before. So I'd say that it was a combination, to be honest, of the back and forth and going through the coding that I had done and sort of mapping that on to what's been done. Because I think while the actual use of evidence and the tweeting about evidence doesn't quite map on in the data set, what does map on quite well is the discourses, even though I think the positives are sort of getting amplified and the negatives are getting drowned out a little bit. I think there was quite a bit to work with already, but as I said, there's lots of work to do in moving forward. And I think it could be that I collaborate with other people, and there could be some sort of double coding of the discourses that I've highlighted, and we could definitely compare them as well when we get through to further stages of the systematic review. This is the sort of thing that could be compared to the themes that come out of the academic studies. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Vanessa. Thank you. And I'm just going to slot two of the questions that we've had come in on the chat together, which is talking about the location of these tweets and thinking about whether you've explored disaggregating by country or regional characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of scope for that. And it's, as I mentioned, things like network analysis and also looking at the location. I just couldn't squeeze that into the 10 minutes. But the good thing about when the data was extracted from Twitter is that it gives you a whole heap of fields. So all the metadata that is connected to any tweet, again, I don't want to scare people in the audience, there's a whole lot that gets extracted. And it sort of eliminate, when we're talking about doing systematic reviews, we're limited to obviously the evidence that is out there. And as with when we extract data from Twitter, some of the tweets are a little bit more complete in the data that comes with that. But there are there are a lot of them, yes, that do have location data attached to that. And obviously, I mean, there's different sorts. So some of them will be posted in a location which comes up as a field in an Excel file. But then, if we're doing manual coding of a sample, for example, they might be posted in one specific location, but they might talk about other locations. So I think there are different locations to bear in mind. If we're thinking about the entire data set, then yeah, there's automated location data that can be looked at and disaggregated. And then if we're looking at the smaller samples, then I think we can definitely look more at what locations have been spoken about and what policy areas and things like that, or even development impact bonds versus talking about more developed context. So so that's a great question, and there's lots of interesting work to be done with that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I'd now like to move us into the more discussion format of this session. So one of the themes that you're starting to elaborate on, Vanessa, is this shifting of narratives over time that you're describing across the whole ecosystem, but that we might also be seeing on projects themselves. So I was just wanted to go back and ask Mathilde for any reflections on narrative shifts in the different case sites that she worked with. And Vincenzo, if you have any thoughts on the other presentations that you've heard, what are the implications of their frameworks for your analysis? So maybe we could go to Mathilde first.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think it's not only narrative that change over time, and this is actually happening in France at the beginning. In 2016, there was a more cautionary narrative around social impact bonds and what they could bring to the welfare states, how they could undermine it. And now there is the idea that we can massify the French version of social impact bonds and make it bigger. So it's not only the narratives that change, but it's also the material features of social impact bonds. I think both aspects are really intertwined. It's not on one side a political discourse, and on the other side material things. It's all it comes together. For example, the calls for proposals in France it's a way of implementing social impact bonds, but it's also a way to preserve the welfare state guides. In Colombia, the development of guidance and methodologies is really a way to preserve accountability. And in Colombia, it was the same thing with the quite heavy assets management methods that I didn't talk about in my presentation, but this was really meant to sustain an impact investment market. So I have been also interested in how these material and political things have evolved together.
Thank you, Mathilde. Vincenzo, there have also been a couple of questions for you. So feel free to offer comments across any questions that you've seen come through in the chat or your reflections on the other presentations.
Yes, great. So first of all, to answer to your question, Eleanor, but also the narratives, our study, I think that they show how, because of course we can acknowledge how we can find also between the actor engaged in the development of SIBs, so public actors notably. So we have different kind of justification how to justify the need of this this tool, but because our research was centered on what happened after, we can see how how actors justify the need of a SIB, for example, between the first objective, for example, to bring private investor in a payment for result mechanism, or for example, the other ones, to test, to experiment new ways to new social practices. For example, only with this example, you can see how then what's happened after. It's also influenced by this first conceptualization of the need of the SIBs. So very quickly, also to answer to Stefan's question that really in a really interesting way pointed out that we can also show even more broadly, not only as the scaling process of our process innovation, so of SIBs, payment by result mechanism, or on the other side, the scaling of social programs. Here we can show how, the SIBs create some more broad diffusion of practices in the public sector, for example, more broadly the culture of evaluation or others. And we acknowledge that, and this is a really interesting point, but from our perspective, we choose to really focus on the scaling process of a specific innovation, but is still really an interesting point that can open also interesting research avenue for us, also for everyone.
Thanks, Vincenzo. So we're picking up on this idea of sort of potential ripple effects moving both through the local provider organisations, but I think potentially also out into the public administration. And Richard, I wonder if I could pass to you to think about some of the themes that we've been touching on here. We've been talking about scale and what a successfully scaled impact bond might look like. We're also talking about flexibility and spillover effects. Do you have any practical reflections on the back of the presentations that you've heard that touch on any of those themes?
Sure, thank you. 4 fascinating presentations. Difficult to respond because they're very diverse presentations and each very rich in terms of the content. I would actually ask whether the narrative and the logic has actually shifted. And if they have in some way, or we perceive them to have shifted, then what is it telling us, and is it actually a problem in operational terms, in terms of operating these things, of applying them? So I think when we pay for outcomes, we get more outcomes, basically. If I want jobs, I need to pay for jobs instead of paying for training programs that may or may not lead to employment. Now, of course, the contract and the payment model has got to be well designed. The procurement has got to make sure it doesn't screw up. And you've got to have some good ongoing performance management in place. But generally, this is the case. If you pay for outcomes with a good contract, you could get more of them. So why is it so hard to get more of these in play? Why do we keep having this conversation about the barriers to scaling it up? Why is it so difficult traveling around the world trying to persuade people of what seems to be common sense, quite honestly, to Joe Public? Language is incredibly important, as we've seen with all of these tweets. And I think gathering support for these requires us to establish a common language. Try and give you a sort of a practical example of this. I've worked for a number of years recently in Afghanistan, helping to redesign the contracts for basic and essential health services. So when the Taliban fell in 2001 and the world community entered the country, there were no health services pretty much. So in order to rapidly deploy basic and essential health services, they contracted it out, initially to international NGOs. And then over time, that migrated to local NGOs. So as of 3 weeks ago, all of these services were delivered by a network of these local organizations with international support. And they'd done pretty well. In comparative terms, internationally, those services had actually done pretty good stuff in relation to infant mortality and that sort of thing. But their performance had plateaued. So 2-3 years ago, I was asked to go in and have a look at how they were contracting this stuff to see how we could improve the performance. And I went around all the various stakeholders in the Ministry of Health and in the palace, in the donors, and I said, so, okay, we want to improve the performance of this stuff. Tell me, what is performance? And no one could tell me. There was no common definition. Everyone had a completely different view of what it looks like, of what success was. And in order to recontract this stuff, we basically had to get everyone to agree, okay, performance means delivering more and better health services to more people. End of. Nice, simple, clear definition. Once we've got that agreed, then we can start redesigning a contract around it. Our definition, our understanding, our common understanding of performance and of what any of these contracts are supposed to be achieving has to be simple, clear, and as closely tied to the outcome, the objective, the better. Impact bonds might be part of our problem, or the title might be part of our problem. And I've spent hours giving presentations on impact bonds to the economists in the World Bank. And at the end of every 90-minute presentation, someone puts their hand up and goes, but that's not a bond. And they'll go away, and a week later they'll say, oh, it was an interesting presentation, but they're not bonds. And that's as far as you get. Is the tail wagging the dog a bit here? Are we spending all of our time focused on, oh, I want to introduce an impact bond, instead of, I want to deliver more and better health services for more people? What is the best structure to achieve that? Is it public? Is it private? How do I pay for it? How do I performance manage it? And then let that structure follow the objective. That's when you get it to work. I think the stuff that Celeste does with these village enterprises, with this business development is fantastic. But I really worry about the way we structure it within a bond and attach payments to it, attaching payments to an impact evaluation. I'm glad I don't run that program. In the SIBs and the DIB that I chair, every single month, we have a program review board, and we look at how we are tracking month by month on the key indicators towards our contract cap. How many of X, Y, and Z are we achieving in this month? And if we're not getting enough Ys, what are we going to do differently next month in order to get more of them? I don't have to wait 12, 18, 24 months until someone has done a blasted randomized control trial to tell me that income increased in this village or didn't to get my payment. When you translate this stuff into services on the ground, you need to be connecting those payments to meaningful deliverables that you can manage against. That's how you drive the performance. And if you get that contract right, then you get your flexibility, but God knows how you get the scale, because why don't we get more of this stuff? Okay.
Thanks, Richard. I knew we could rely on you for some energising and punchy reflections. So I wonder actually if I could pass back to you, Celeste, to pick up on some of these shifts around narratives. And I'm wondering whether you could cast your mind back to the early days of the development of the project that you mentioned and the justifications for using this outcomes contract and attaching payment around the RCT structure, and think about how does that map onto your reflections now in terms of what you see the potential benefits, if you see them, of using this outcomes contract, and also what next? What might scale look like for you?
Sure. Yeah. And this also, I think, relates back to, or your comments, Richard, I think actually are a good segue into how I would respond here, because the use of the RCT is the mechanism for validating our impact was something where we certainly saw the benefit in the context of a pilot where the consortium was very interested in having highly rigorous learning. But at the same time, it is one of the design decisions that we are not keen to scale. Both because of the measurement risk that the evaluation introduced to the project. And so by that, I mean the risk that we were not, that actually I think materialized as a result of the pandemic, where we were not able to measure what we originally set out to measure. We still are carrying through with the evaluation, and it will be very interesting findings. But at this point in time, over a year delayed and in the midst of a pandemic, it is a different question that we're answering. And also from the perspective of even in the original design, the external learning was meant to come after implementation ended. And we think that there is a high importance of being able to have the learning during the course of the project to help with course correction. And so as we think about scaling, one of the things that we're thinking about is use of intermediary outcomes that are correlated to our outcome of interest. And so for our impact bond, one of the things that we collaborated on with the external evaluator was ensuring that our internal monitoring and evaluation data on all of the outcomes that we monitor internally can be merged with the data that they're collecting for correlation analysis to help us hopefully in future versions of contracting select a range of indicators where we can track them in a more timely fashion. And so then in terms of thinking about like our design choice in the context of larger trends with impact bonds, I think that the evaluation mechanisms so far have been one of the barriers to further adoption of the impact bonds. And so I think that and I don't think that the use of RCTs is, I think that it's something where we've seen the use in a very small number of bonds is practitioners have started to become more interested in pushing the frontier on paying based on outcomes and paying based on outcomes that can be attributed to the project. But I think that what we're seeing there is more of an experimental phase, and that in reality, like if we do intend to make progress scaling these mechanisms, that we'll have to find some degree of middle ground and also find ways to find some more innovative ways to validate outcomes through use of maybe like administrative data from the practitioners that's validated by an auditor to help reduce the cost of evaluation, or integration of like third-party data sets, like satellite data for evaluation, like different sort of innovative approaches to evaluation.
Many thanks, Celeste. There's some really interesting provocations and questions coming through in the chat. And I think I spotted one, I think it was from Fernando, and I think it was targeted at Vanessa, thinking about the evolution of terms and hashtags over time. And I think Fernando might also have spotted a connection between your work and the global systematic review that we were talking about earlier. But Fernando, are you able to come off mute and ask your question?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you all. So thank you, Vanessa, as well, and all the presenters. So I guess that as we try to incorporate other contracts apart from SIBs in this broader outcomes-based contract landscape, Twitter data might be really, really useful because whatever is new is there first. So all these new varieties might appear over there. So I guess that it's a really good opportunity to combine efforts together with the other folks trying to understand what is new.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you for that idea. I think you know, the good thing about getting familiar with this data and with the methods for using this data is that I've sort of learned how to acquire the data, and it's just a case of tweaking the terms. Similar to doing a systematic review and rerunning the view, it's quite easy to pull in additional terms in the future. So you're right, I think there could be an interesting piece in sort of updating it to make sure that it is aligned to the terms that we've discovered in the review. And I think that, yeah, one of the sort of most interesting findings, I guess, is the stark disconnect between what has been coming out in academic literature and what is seen in the tweets. So I think if we can explore that a little more and sort of line it up with the review and see where there's overlap and where there's not, I think we can learn a lot, not just, you know, we're obviously trying to learn about how and why these things might work, but I think there's a lot that can be learned about how and why this idea has spread throughout the public sector, especially when we probably don't know as much as we'd hope to know at this point about the SIB effect. So yeah, hopefully by joining up the data, we can do that. So yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
Thank you. I noticed that the time has crept up on us to wrap this session up, but I would really like to extend my thanks firstly to all of our participants online and in the room. Thank you for joining us in this session. I'd like to thank our panelists here. So Mathilde, Vincenzo, Celeste, Vanessa, thank you very much for your presentations. Richard, thank you for keeping our feet on the ground and offering us some reflections. There is the opportunity to give your feedback on this session in the chat. You'll see a link to a Slido survey to give us some feedback on how you found this session and how we might be able to improve it in the future. But thank you so much for joining us, everyone. I've really enjoyed hearing the sort of cutting edge reshaping of the impact bond model, how that might be different in different contexts and how it's evolving. So thanks for being so open and sharing your research and insights with us all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and what's next? If you want to stay on the line to have a bit of a debrief and socialise, then please do stay in Zoom and we can put you into